Today I'm joined by an amazing panel of all women. Unfortunately, I spoil that to make it completely women. But I'd like to introduce them. We have, in order, if I get it correctly here, we have my friend Hajar, who was the former Minister of State for the Republic of the Maldives. We have Srilata, who's, again, a friend of mine, Srilata Kimilla, who's the head of adaptation at UNDP. We have Adele Thomas, Senior Director, Climate Adaptation at NRDC, and also the IPCC Working Group 2 Vice Chair. And last but definitely not least, we have Amanda McKee, who's Director for the NDC Partnership, Knowledge and Learning. Of course, the NDC Partnership doing huge amounts of work to help developing countries produce their NDCs. So just a bit of housekeeping. We'll have hopefully around 15 minutes or so for questions from members of the audience, but also if you're online, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom application to pose a question, and if we have time, we'll try to allow you to interact with us as well. But first, I'd like to turn to Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio, who's the Senior Advisor on Adaptation at the UN Foundation, and who hopefully should be joining us virtually. Are you there, Cristina?
Hi, Kaveh. Can you hear me?
We can. You're here live.
Super.
You're live and well and 100% size in Baku. So,
oh dear.
So thank you for joining us. So, Cristina,
pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Cristina. I was going to ask you. This is what I often ask my team because I'm not an expert in this area, but maybe you could explain what is transformational adaptation and give some examples of how countries are actually implementing transformational adaptation. Over to you.
Thanks, Kaveh. I have a short presentation. I don't know if that's loaded or if you want me to share it from my end.
Just give us a couple of moments here, Cristina. Yes.
Super.
It's up on the screen.
Great.
Go ahead.
I can see it there. Perfect. If I could have the next slide, please. So I want to talk to what's happening at COP this week on transformational adaptation. And sorry to make people move to see the presentation. But in essence, responding to IPCC findings that adaptation is fragmented, small scale in nature, and responding to the fact that the temperature goal is getting further and further away from us, but still hope that we can meet it. There was a request made by the CMA last year that asked the Secretariat to produce a report on transformational adaptation, how it's defined, how it's understood, how we might measure progress or assess progress. And that report was released just last week, although that feels already like a year ago. Next slide. And it outlines different understandings and definitions of transformational adaptation. The IPCC in its AR6 report provides one definition that really highlights that transformation is about changing the fundamental attributes of the system, addressing the root causes of vulnerability, whereas different donors have their own definitions, like the climate investment funds, just to show a slightly different definition, highlights the same issue of fundamental changes, but also that it's inclusive and equitable, and really emphasizes scale, that it's a large-scale shift, and positive, which I think is important to note. There's other definitions from the literature, from academia out there, that emphasize different aspects, and some have even suggested that it's impossible to have one definition, and that we might stick with a I can't say the word, you know what I mean, lots of definitions.
Plurality.
Next slide. Thank you, Kaveh. You're catching me before breakfast. And I just want to highlight one definition that actually came from the Action on Climate Today program and a framework. I led that program from 2015 to 2019. It was a program focused on mainstreaming adaptation across different sectors, across 5 countries in South Asia. And we looked across our portfolio of many dozens of projects and initiatives and said, what, if any of this, is transformational, and how would we even know it. And so we came up with this framework to assess our own work and reflect on our own work. And it really highlights the nature of systemic change, that it's not just about single slivers, single sectors, but something that's far-reaching, that's catalytic, that kind of brings about further changes, that's at scale or has the potential to scale or a mechanism for scale. That there's equity and inclusion really at the heart of it, and maybe a rewiring of power dynamics to address the root causes of vulnerability and those equity issues, and that it's sustainable in the sense of durable. And of course, to be durable, it also needs to be environmentally sustainable. And I include the QR code for a paper that was published, sort of detailing what that looked like in practice. But just to highlight, next slide, some of the elements that are common across multiple definitions, and the different wordings that are used, I think, to express common ideas. That this is about fundamental changes, addressing root causes, that the changes are very deep, and might change the soft limits to adaptation. So this is about expanding coping capacity, reducing vulnerability or sensitivity to climate change. That the scale of change is large, and maybe multi-scalar. And the changes are durable and long-term and hard to reverse. The paper put out by the Secretariat really kind of highlights speed as a speed of change as an element, that there's rapid adoption or scaling in the sense of like the Malcolm Gladwell tipping points sorts of scenarios, and many definitions emphasize equity and inclusion and justice considerations, that it's not going to be transformational unless it addresses the fundamental equity and justice considerations that often lead to vulnerabilities. Next slide. So you asked for some examples. I'll highlight just a few that often come up in the literature. Things like community relocation or managed retreat to places that are more resilient and less vulnerable. Things like assisted migration of species because they're no longer able to migrate on their own. Reintroduction of fire into wildlands to reduce wildfire risks, as we've seen in parts of Australia where indigenous fire practices are being restored. Decentralized water management to cope with extreme drought. What we've seen in India, restoration of the traditional water tank systems and the baulis to help cope with more erratic rainfall. Coastal restoration to cope with sea level rise and coastal storms. Large-scale infrastructure, like here in the UK, we have the Thames Barrier to help manage coastal storms, sea level rise. Or large-scale changes in agriculture. WRI has done some work detailing how that's beginning to happen where, for instance, shade-grown coffee is no longer a viable crop, and so there's shift to new crops like citrus, which are pretty deep changes. This raises some issues and some apprehensions that I don't want to gloss over, and we've heard these in the negotiations as well. But a question on, is transformational inherently positive? Is it necessarily better than more incremental approaches? Is this the new bar for accessing funding? Is this what funders are going to require now, making it more difficult to access funding? Can we even differentiate between incremental approaches and transformational approaches? Is there a clear line between those? How do we know in advance if an approach is transformational or not? Or even if we can't tell in advance, how do we measure progress after the fact? And then how does it differ from loss and damage? So I gave examples of managed retreat or switching of crops. These are changes that you have to make because of very severe climate impacts. In effect, because you're not able to adapt the status quo. So how does this actually differ from loss and damage? And then who bears the risks of transformational approaches? How do we manage potential maladaptation, which might be even deeper, more severe when you're talking about deeper transformations? So a number of these issues have been raised, and I know we'll hear from the panel different examples and different considerations. But next slide. I just wanted to put forward a few avenues forward for consideration at COP. We do have this report, and parties may choose to put forward a decision around transformational adaptation. That decision may want to articulate some different elements that we can all agree on around what transformational adaptation means and looks like. But equally, it might acknowledge that there are different definitions, that there are these apprehensions that exist. We might use the opportunity to encourage parties to highlight their experiences, maybe both positive and negative, or neutral, with transformational approaches in their reporting or in the next round of NDCs and NAPs. We might call on funding agencies to support transformational approaches, but make it clear that this should not be at the expense of incremental approaches. And then there might be since we're working on indicators for the UAE framework for global climate resilience, there might be an opportunity there to incorporate indicators around transformational adaptation within that indicator set. There could be a request to the Adaptation Committee to do more work in this space, for instance, to address how progress might be assessed, because that wasn't fully achieved in the report that was produced. And there might even be an invitation to the IPCC in AR7 and in its updating of guidelines on climate impacts and adaptation to look at this issue. Of course, probably don't want to be too prescriptive here, but just some ideas to think about as we are at COP that could be taken forward on this issue. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Christina. I really value our collaboration with the UN Foundation and really appreciate your commitment and getting up there before breakfast, wherever you are. Please do stay with us. Adele and Shalata, please come back and you stay there because you fit nicely between two of the panelists on the screen there. When you were speaking there, Christina, I was really struck by your excellent definition, but also when you gave examples, I couldn't help notice Haja next to me was basically nodding at all of the examples, and particularly your face when we talked about relocation and managed retreat, which is, of course, an extremely sensitive and upsetting thing to think about for a country that is one of the most vulnerable on the planet to climate change. But can you maybe dive in a little bit more into sort of what aspects of transformational adaptation might be most useful for countries, maybe some of the most vulnerable, and what aspects are challenging for you?
Thank you so much, Kaveh, and it's a pleasure to be here on the panel with all of the guests here. Is it working? Yeah. I think reflecting on transformational adaptation, I'd have to say that as a former government official, adaptation is, of course, one of the most important things that the Maldives has to deliberate on. And one of the challenges is that we are a country of several islands. We have 200 resorts that are independent islands, and we also have people living on 200 islands. So you can see that we have to make management plans for all of these islands. And one of the most difficult things is also the fact that climate change impacts our sea level rise. We have severe. We also have. We also have more storm surges than before, and all of our critical infrastructure is less than 100 meters from the shore. So this really puts everything at risk, and we really have to rethink about how we plan in the face of all of these challenges. And another issue that we face is the fact that we have limited fiscal capacities, and we're a middle income country, and adaptation is often a lot of hard engineering for us in terms of putting the sea walls, in terms of building harbors, and putting the protections around the islands. And so this is very expensive, and this is one of the things that unfortunately we have to do. And because we're displaced, because we're dispersed population, and because there are needs on all these islands, it is, of course, adds to the burden. So how is transformational adaptation important for us? So first, in the social political context, you can imagine that making decisions for all of these islands in these very short time frames are quite challenging. So oftentimes it's very difficult for us to do the right amount of consultations and to take into account of all the impact assessments and access the best available science, sure that the structures that we are putting in is actually helping, and instead of making things worse. So, but because of political cycles and having to fit these very, very long-lasting measures into these cycles, it's really one of the key challenges that we face. And I think that if we consider transformational adaptation instead of incremental, because we are going to be thinking long term, because it will have to figure a way to address the underlying risks that we are facing, but also make sure that the communities, the livelihoods, and all of these soft measures and the hard measures are actually taking into consideration the future scenarios. So oftentimes it's very reactive for us, adaptation, and we do not have the luxury of planning for long term, and also the difficult political context and the social context make it extra hard. So while I understand that there's been so many definitions and different thoughts on transformational adaptation, it is really important, because adaptation, essentially the purpose is to increase well-being by addressing the underlying risks, is highlighted in the GGA to the Global Goal on Adaptation, on which parties are working to develop indicators on health, water, biodiversity, ecosystems, etc. The whole point is to be able to project the future scenarios, address the underlying risks to these systems, and to be able to plan forward in a way that not only addresses the risk, but allow communities to live well and increase their overall well-being and change the development trajectory. So for the Maldives, it would look very different in terms of things like population consolidation, which we cannot as policy makers even begin to discuss, because it's very tough. Even if an island has 300 people, it is their home and they are very rooted there, and it's about their cultures and their whole history. So these are very difficult concepts. But on the other hand, if we have to think of the future scenarios and how we can still stay there and live well in the face of this limited time, it would be beneficial, I'd imagine, to be able to project for that future and to use the best available technologies to do the systematic and long-term changes. And I think that's in a sense, like in practice, what it could look like for Maldives, in how we design how we do our hard infrastructure, how to protect the critical infrastructures, etc. But also how to incorporate the values and the protection of people's livelihoods, etc. in the face, and the people are better off than before. And I think this requires a mind shift, and it requires to look forward-looking policy making, and pretty much design our lives for the future in the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Harja. I was really struck in particular by one thing that it's always great to get your perspective, because there's not any countries on the planet that have greater challenges for adaptation than yours. But I was really struck by your point about that we need to think about the well-being of people, because there's increasing accusations that this climate process that we're here at COP29 is abstract and it's not speaking to people, and I think we really need to do that. I think the other message I got, although you didn't use the words, you were much more eloquent, is to take a more sort of systemic and strategic approach, and maybe that's another definition to what transformational adaptation means. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Shalata Kamila. Shalata and I had the pleasure of working together, or at least I did. I think I think she taught me a lot about adaptation at the time of the Secretary General's Summit in 2019. So we worked on the adaptation aspect of that. And I'm a huge fan of UNDP and all the work that it's doing, particularly on things like the climate promise. But so how is the UNDP supporting countries in transformational change, including on adaptation, but also implementing the SDGs? And what are you doing in various countries on that? So over to you, Charlotte. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. And you can hear me as well? Great. Firstly, thank you. I mean, this is such an important conversation. There's a lot of conversations happening at COP and for adaptation. I think, given the urgency and the scale, what does it actually mean if you're going back to certain definitions? I think it's really critical conversation. So thank you for having us on this panel. I mean, transformational adaptation and in general, the idea of adaptation is very, very central to development for UNDP. As a development agency, adaptation action is development action. And also, I always remind people it is climate risk and maybe opportunity-informed development. So it is development overlaid with the climate context, and going back to how do you look at climate risks that then overlay on socioeconomic risks and others as well. So, and I think it's also good to see, obviously with IPCC, the shifting the focus and making the case for transformational, in addition to some of the incremental approaches that have been in place. And I mean, by and large, I think in that context, we need to understand, because adaptation is highly contextual. It's about adjusting, it's about learning, and it's really about being able to advance, again, changes that, perhaps medium, but also long term, right? I think maybe that's one of the ways to think about what's incremental and what's transformational as well. Now, I just wanted to refer to, for example, the global stocktake, and we talk about the SDGs, but global stocktake has made it very clear that the work on adaptation so far has been fairly uneven, fairly insufficient, and largely incremental. So there is a need, of course, to advance both incremental and transformational approaches, but it also refers to economic and non-economic losses that further restrict financing to things like SDGs. So how do we look at aligning, the Paris and SDG agenda in that light is also an important element, I think, of transformational adaptation, because it's an important collaboration to have. I also wanted to bring up the UAE framework for global climate resilience that highlights the thematic areas like water, food and agriculture, poverty and livelihoods, health, infrastructure, cultural heritage, and all of these themes are really critical for the SDGs. So again, I think the links are very clear. So for UNDP, when we talk about transformational adaptation, it's really about addressing, and Christina pointed to this, it's like the root causes and the root systemic issues that exacerbate risks to climate change and the deep-rooted vulnerabilities. And so for us to look at development adaptation as intertwined is non-negotiable in a way, right? It needs to go together for long-term and sustainable change. And in terms of UNDP's own work, just referring to what, the AR6 and the global stocktake and the technical report by the Secretariat mentioned in terms of transformational adaptation, again, across various elements, like it needs to be widespread, it has to be rapid and deep, it's about exceeding soft limits, challenging hard limits. While there have been few and far in between examples, I just want to maybe highlight a few across those dimensions of what can be considered as transformational. So for example, if we were to think about scope and depth, there's an example of a project in Malawi that looks at Lake Chilwa, and a large-scale ecosystem-based adaptation project that also, on top of the EBA work, also looks at diversifying and finding alternative livelihoods for communities that have been relying on these kinds of ecosystems. And so it really looks at value chains and markets as well in a way that builds up the human, economic, natural capacities, which it could be one way of looking at transformational adaptation, going back to, Christina, your point on these multi-sectoral and multiple dots to connect. Another example on scope and depth could be a platform UNDP works on called Adaptation Innovation Marketplace. And it's a fungible architecture which is funded by different projects. One of the projects funded by Adaptation Fund and EU. And we really look at enterprise-based development and accelerating innovation in technologies or business models and practices for adaptation. So an example is an entrepreneur and an organization that the project supported called SAFE in India. And it's this organizations looking at floating like hydroponic farms and really looking at women-based enterprises. So both the nature and the solution with nature, but also finance and entrepreneurship and innovation with gender focus. Maybe a couple of more examples quickly. I could, in terms of the depth and limits, there's a project actually funded by German funding, and it's called Scaling Ambition for Land Use and Agriculture in NDCs, SCALA. And, it's jointly with FAO, and we looked at landscape level assessment. So, for example, in Uganda, there's a cattle corridor where we did a participatory, very systemic assessment that looked at what kind of resilience building solutions, and it helped us identify and prioritize farming systems from livestock breeding to pasture land management to, again, dairy and cassava value chains. And the district level planners are now looking at these kind of priorities to say, how do we bring in the gender lens to it? How do we bring the market lens to it? How do we bring innovation to it? Again, speaking to, I think, transformational in the sense of how it connects to various levers of change, because there is no separate climate and development in that sense. So I'm happy to share more examples, but just in terms of the approaches, and maybe a last point to say on NAPS, and all these frameworks point to, having NAPS by 2025 and starting to implement by 2030. And I think some of the apprehension questions that Christina raised as well, to really use these vehicles as a way of consultations and cross-sectoral way of identifying what's incremental and transformational would be important. Thank you.
Thanks, Shalata. You mentioned NAPS at the end. There's a lot of talk about NDCs at this COP, but it's very worrying how few countries have actually come forward with NAPS. So hopefully, many good examples there, but the thing that really struck me was basically your point about adaptation, climate action and ambition are development ambition and action. I think that'll be music to the ears of various colleagues here in the audience, I'm sure, including me. I'd like to now turn to you, Adele. During Christina's presentation, she highlighted one of the definitions of transformational adaptation was from the IPCC, but also mentioned that the decision here from COP29 may ask for further work from the IPCC Working Group 2, which of which you're one of the vice chairs. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the IPCC can take forward this agenda of transformational adaptation. Over to you, Adele. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think first I'll just reflect on how the IPCC has addressed transformational adaptation and transformational change in the sixth assessment report, and is very much going to complement the framing that you used in the previous intervention. So the sixth assessment report of the IPCC is very clear that transformative system change is required in order to meet the SDGs and to respond to escalating climate risks and impacts that we're seeing now. So we're already seeing significant changes in the climate system. We're seeing impacts of climate change all over the world. We're seeing that our actions are actually resulting in a transformation of our environment. We have much different environmental conditions now as compared to pre-industrial times. And so these rapid changes are being felt everywhere around the world. However, while we are seeing this transformation in our environment, we are not responding to these changes in a transformational way. We are simply not keeping pace with our current levels of adaptation. We're largely seeing incremental adaptation measures that do not respond to the levels of impacts and risks that we face. So it's clear that our business as usual approach is not going to cut it. And so the IPCC AR6 report calls for transformational change in both mitigation and adaptation. We know that we're not on track to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees. Staying within that limit means that we need deep, rapid, and immediate greenhouse gas reductions across all sectors over the next 6 years. We need to peak emissions before 2025 and achieve net zero by the early 2050s. And so this requires a transformation in how we produce and use energy. So we need a transformation in mitigation. Business as usual, cutting back a little here and a little there is not working, as we have seen to date. It's not going to get us where we need to be as it relates to global warming. And so this same need for drastic changes applies to adaptation. We need to see transformation and system transitions across sectors and across all aspects of society in order to respond to the transformation and the environment that we have caused. So in the AR6, we understand adaptation to take place across a continuum from incremental to transformational. There's not a binary between what can be considered incremental and what can be considered transformational. There's a spectrum. So there's not a clear line, which Christina had brought up earlier. In the report, we developed a framework to assess the transformative potential of different adaptation measures. So again, going back to this continuum and this spectrum. The transformative potential of adaptation can be measured according to its depth, scope, and speed. And I'll just briefly highlight what we mean by that. For depth, low transformative potential is adaptation that is largely business as usual, with very little change to underlying values, assumptions, or norms. High transformative potential goes further in depth. It reflects entirely new practices involving deep structural reform, such as a complete change in mindset and changing institutional or behavioral norms. Next, looking at scope. Low transformative potential is adaptation that is largely at a very small scale. It's fragmented and there's little coordination or mainstreaming across sectors. High potential relates to adaptation that is widespread and substantial. It includes as many sectors as possible with different levels of governance and different actors involved. And finally, speed. Low transformative potential is adaptation that is implemented very slowly. We see the impacts of climate change are happening before we actually put in adaptation measures to respond to them. High transformational potential is when the change is occurring rapidly. So we're actually adapting before we see some of these impacts of climate change. So what this sort of framework does is it highlights that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to transformational adaptation. What is considered transformational is going to be completely different in different contexts. So it's good to have examples to show like what's considered transformational in one place versus another place. It's very difficult to say this is a list and only these adaptation measures are considered transformational. So again, this continuum of what's considered incremental and going all the way up to transformational. So what we did in the AR6 report was to provide this framework for different people to think about the transformative potential of adaptation. And we really wanted to stress that what we're doing around the world now is not enough. And we want to encourage people to think about the systemic and large-scale changes that need to happen to respond to climate risks. And in addition to this scope, depth, and speed, transformational adaptation should ideally address the root causes of vulnerability and long-standing inequities. So getting to the very heart of addressing exposure and vulnerability that contribute to climate risk. And so we really got into this situation that we see ourselves in now of high climate risks and impacts being concentrated in the most vulnerable groups of society because of high levels of inequity and structural policies and practices that only privilege a few. And so if we are to truly transform how we live, then we need to also address these power structures that concentrate resources and wealth in particular places and segments of society while leaving the rest of the world to grapple with climate impacts. And I think that's, has been the ongoing fight of all of the COPs. And so to end, we're seeing the transformation in our environment due to the climate change that we have caused. And if we are to effectively respond to that transformation, we need to also transform how we live. And that means transformative mitigation and transformative adaptation that addresses the root causes of vulnerability. Leave it there.
Thank you so much, Adele. I think that was a fantastically clear explanation of what transformational adaptation is. And I was, again, your point that I think the system that we're working in has resulted in incremental change, but we are not changing quickly enough. So transformation across the board, mitigation and adaptation is absolutely essential. I'm going to come back to you with a follow-up question later. Just a reminder, if anyone in the audience has questions, have them in your head. We'll open up that, and also online, if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function, and we'll try to give you a chance to ask a question from wherever you are. So last but not least, I'm coming to Amanda with the NDC partnership, who's doing fantastic work helping developing countries prepare the next round of climate targets. Amanda, how do you see nationally determined contributions incorporating strategies and approaches that could drive transformational adaptation? Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. And let me just start by saying a quick word on the NDC partnership, because I think this will help set the context for what we're doing. So we really are a coalition of countries and institutions, both developed and developing countries, and many of the institutions actually on the panel today, working to support countries to plan and implement ambitious, achievable NDCs, really working towards achievement of the Paris Agreement goals and the SDGs. So the Sustainable Development Goals are actually in our impact statement, and it's a core part. And I just wanted to pick up on that because I think you really nicely explained how important the link between adaptation and development is. And for a lot of us working in this space, I think it's obvious. But then when we talk about it, we often forget to reiterate. So I wanted to start by mentioning that. The next thing I wanted to lay out is how countries are approaching adaptation through the NDCs, and particularly through the NDC partnership. So we are currently supporting 100 of our developing country members to implement their NDCs and to develop their NDCs 3.0. Often people think about the NDC document as mitigation focused, but 65 of these 100 countries that I mentioned are requesting support specifically on adaptation. So this is not a fringe group, it's not a small part, it's actually the majority of countries are really looking at how adaptation fits into their NDC. On the flip side, though, if we look at the support that's coming to those requests, 50% of those requests remain unsupported. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, and this is something we're working very closely with the Climate Promise on, how we can scale up support to countries on these topics so that when they are putting in place ambitious NDCs, there's the resources available for them to be able to implement it, but also the resources give countries the confidence to strive for more. And I think when we're talking about transformational adaptation, again, this isn't just about project by project. These are programs. This is really resource intensive stuff. I wanted to give a few examples actually of how countries are approaching this through the partnership. I think we heard some definitions earlier, and I just wanted to complement it with what we're seeing on the ground. So looking specifically at support around the NDCs 3.0, we have in El Salvador, they're conducting a situational analysis to identify the sectors that will be most affected by extreme events and slow onset events, and the costs associated with the effects at the sectoral level. And so some of the outputs here include design and implementation of capacity building processes for institutional and technical teams, so they can understand climate loss and damages, as well as institutional strengthening. And this is actually work that the UNDP is supporting through the partnership. Another example is in Namibia, where they're formulating the basis for their long-term low-emission development strategy and climate-resilient development strategy through a comprehensive series of whole-of-society consultations with different ministries and societal stakeholders, both at the national and regional levels. And I picked two very different examples to illustrate the range of how countries are thinking about this as they work on their NDC 3.0 and also the links to the LT LEDs. The last thing that I wanted to highlight is just some of the additional support that we're looking to provide to countries. So one of the things that we found with this particular round of NDCs is that there's really no shortage of guidance available. And there's no shortage of partners who have the expertise on how to do it. But as a country, how do you understand what's available to you? And how do you understand how to apply that to your own specific national context? So working together with the UNFCCC Secretariat and then with inputs from a number of technical partners, we developed a tool which is called the NDC 3.0 Navigator, which lays out specific routes for how countries can think about their NDC 3.0 in ways that they can raise ambition, but also implement the NDC in a meaningful way. And so we do have a specific route, for instance, that looks at adaptation and how you can really incorporate and meet the global goal on adaptation. The other thing just to mention about this tool is coming down from these routes, we offer strategies for how to do that and then resources. So drawing together all of the resources that partners have produced on this, and then using that and working with countries so that they can formulate requests for support that we can bring to our network of partners to be able to respond and help them with that. The last thing we recognized is that looking at the outcomes of the global stocktake last year, specifically on adaptation, that there was a bit of a gap in terms of how countries would then take those forward and implement them. How do you take a global recommendation and apply it within your national context? And so we put together a group of experts, and actually a few of the experts are on the panel today, to really think about that. And what we came up with were 12 recommendations on how countries, or I guess the opportunities for inclusion of adaptation in NDCs 3.0. So really considering the global goal on adaptation and the global stocktake. And the recommendations are clustered into 3 areas, which I will just conclude with a really brief description of this. The first area is really around raising ambition and doing this through transformational adaptation and climate resilient development. So this includes the full range of plausible climates, or this includes considering, I should say, the full range of plausible climate scenarios, setting a global goal on adaptation aligned and measurable targets, integrating adaptation into development, but also into mitigation plans, and looking specifically at how we can prioritize work on nature-based solutions. The second cluster of recommendations is around how to accelerate implementation, really by aligning the NDC with the NAP, strengthening all stages of the adaptation policy cycle, so from gathering knowledge all the way to the monitoring and evaluation and learning, and then how you do this through a whole of society approach. And then the third category that we're really encouraging countries to look at are how to strengthen the enablers, both at the global but also at the national level. And this can include through enhanced capacity building, but also all of the enabling conditions we know are so critical to unlock adaptation finance.
Thank you so much. A couple of points you raised that really struck a chord with me. One is it's often not a lack of information, but being overwhelmed with information and actually presenting it to policymakers in a digestible way, because I think a lot of people, particularly in the developed world, don't realize that in a department it may be 1 or 2 people, if lucky, who are responsible for all of this, and just pointing them at a bunch of websites is not that helpful. So that was extremely useful to point that out. And I think the theme that you really touched on that came through from everyone's interventions is this idea that this is a sort of, we need to move to a systemic and strategic approach rather than incremental and project level. So I just want to check if anybody has got any questions in the audience. I know there's definitely some very well-learned adaptation experts. I think we may have a question online. I'm just checking with my team here. But in the meantime, I just want to maybe ask Adele. We had in Christina's presentation the allusion to that there could be a decision here that asks for more work from the IPCC. Is that something that you would welcome coming out of the COP? As far as I know, the draft decision text isn't out yet, but it will be soon.
Yeah, so the IPCC for this 7th assessment cycle has committed to having more of a focus on adaptation. For this assessment cycle, we really want to be action-oriented and provide the scientific evidence base that will support transformational climate action, including adaptation. So definitely getting, the signal from parties that they would be interested in more information on transformational adaptation would be quite welcomed. At the end of AR6, we did identify transformational adaptation as an area that does need additional research. And so I think even organically it will show up in AR7 because scientists are responding to that and producing, literature on what transformational adaptation means, trying to further hone in on how we can define it, additional examples, etc. So the IPCC really does assess scientific, indigenous, and local knowledge that is already out there. We don't conduct new knowledge. We don't conduct new research, and so once the research is out there, we can assess it and include it in the AR7 report. So I think coming from AR6, the call for additional research on transformational adaptation. If there also is a call from COP to include more of a focus on that, then I think it will guarantee that we have that in the next cycle. Thanks.
So those of you in the audience who are close to the negotiations heard a very clear call there. We need something in there, instructions or requests to the IPCC, should I say. We have a question here from Florin. Florin, if anyone knows about adaptation, it's you.
Thank you. Given the fact that basically IPCC is using the same definition of transformation adaptation since Rex, which is quite simple, do you think there is any need to really, elaborate more on that definition, or to continue by increasing understanding of what it means through those dimensions? And the second question, you mentioned that the transformation adaptation could lead to maladaptation. So is there any point in trying to distinguish the dimensions of transformation adaptations which are general, which are not, addressing if the transformation is relevant for the goal, or it's leading to the good outcome and so on, and those which are linked to specific outcomes like, because in my view, there's a tendency of overloading all these elements, which are anyway in adaptation and in climate resilient development discussions, and try to put them as specific to transformation adaptation.
Thanks, Florin. Maybe, Adele, if you could take the IPCC one, and if anyone wants to come in on the maladaptation point. Adele, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Christina had talked about maladaptation in her intervention. As it relates to the definition of IPCC on transformational adaptation, and it's been the same definition since SREX, which was back when I was in grad school, so it's been a while. I think that's why we sort of developed the different dimensions in AR6 to help people to understand it more. We've been using that definition, and people, a fundamental shift to people don't grasp what that means. And I think it made it seem as if there was a dichotomy between what can be considered incremental and what can be considered transformational, when we see from the literature that it's not so easy to do that, particularly given the context specific nature of adaptation. So I think the three dimensions, scope, speed, depth, help to bring that definition to life and to help people to see how it applies to their particular situation. I'm sure there's going to be some new way in AR7 as things continue to progress, but I think the underlying goal is to get people to understand that the business as usual, small, tiny little changes that we're doing is simply not enough, and we need to be doing more, and to help people think about what a much different world and what much different action could look like in their context.
Thanks so much, Adele. Christina, you're really well placed there right in the middle of our panel. So maybe you want to take the maladaptation point.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Maybe just to note, I mentioned maladaptation in the context of who bears the risks, and I think that's the question that we need to be asking. And it's not just for transformational approaches, but for incremental approaches as well. I think we need to unpack, when we're talking about innovative practices and deep changes, who is bearing the risk of what happens if those fail, and how do we ensure that it's not the vulnerable or marginalized communities that are bearing all the risk of maladaptation, and maybe just as a counterpoint. So I think we need to think about this further in how we manage the risk of maladaptation. But I want to highlight kind of a counterpoint, and Lisa Schipper and Aditi Mukherjee have a great piece in Science, Perspectives piece, around maladaptation and some of the over concern on both maladaptation and measuring adaptation that's actually hindering progress, and they argue, potentially hurting the poor, because we're using those concerns that adaptation is hard to measure, that maladaptation is always a risk, to not take action, and so I think it's worth putting in perspective the risk of maladaptation. It is there. It shouldn't necessarily be a reason for not taking any action, but we need to unpack the risks and who bears it. That would be my advice for a way forward.
Thank you very much, Christina. I think on those words, I'm going to bring it to a close here. We're just 2 minutes ahead of time, and I would really like to very much thank our panel. It's been fantastic, and a fantastic picture there for all 5 women there with me out of the photo, which is good. I would also really like to thank the audience here and online, but also very much our hosts from UN DESA for consistently over the years putting together this pavilion at the COPs, but also all the work they're doing on the SDGs and climate synergies, which I really appreciate. So thank you very much for joining me. This video will be available online afterwards on the C2S YouTube channel. So thank you very much to all of you, and good luck to everyone here for the rest of the COP. Thank you.